The train arrived at Millfield under a sky heavy with low clouds, a shroud that seemed to press against the earth and swallow the sound of its own whistle. The Hawkins family stepped onto the wooden platform with the uneasy air of newcomers who already sensed they had stepped into something they could not yet name. George Hawkins, a man who valued order and faith, gripped the handle of his eldest son's trunk with a rigid hand. Beside him, his wife Margaret tried to keep her composure, though her eyes scanned the surrounding hills as though looking for a familiar landmark that did not exist. From the start, the town felt wrong. The streets were too quiet, lined with narrow houses whose shutters seemed to observe them rather than shield the interiors. The townsfolk who passed offered perfunctory nods, but their eyes lingered longer than politeness allowed. A doctor from Knoxville, who later studied their case, would note in his journal that the family's first impression was not of welcome, but of surveillance. He wrote, "The moment they set foot in Millfield, they were seen not as strangers, but as inheritors of something left unfinished." By nightfall, when the Hawkins reached their newly purchased home, a two-story farmhouse on the edge of the woods, the unease deepened. The place had been sold cheap, too cheap for land of its size. George had accepted it as a blessing, but Margaret felt it as an omen. She stood on the porch, the lantern trembling slightly in her hand, and remarked that the air smelled of wet stone, though it had not rained. Their youngest, little Anna, pointed to the tree line and asked in her high voice why the other children were watching them. There were no children there. At first, such remarks were dismissed as the fancy of a nervous child in a strange setting. But as the days passed, all three Hawkins children spoke of shadows that followed them, shadows that did not move when they did, that held their place too long against the barn wall or along the staircase. James, the eldest at 12, confided to his mother that he had seen one stand behind his father as he worked, its arms outstretched as though mimicking his every gesture. Margaret asked him not to repeat such things before his sisters, but the doctor's records suggest she herself slept poorly after hearing it. Midway through that first week, George began to sense it too. He told no one, but while chopping wood, he felt the unmistakable weight of being observed. He glanced at the house, then at the woods, but nothing stirred. Yet the impression left him breathless, and the axe slipped dangerously from his grasp. Later, he described it to a visiting clergyman as the silence that comes before thunder, stretched into hours. The tension in the household grew dense, a fog that settled between their conversations. Margaret attempted to anchor the children.
They glanced at the corners of the room. The doctor who compiled the Hawkins case observed that their fear was not born of sudden shock but of accumulation, as if dread seeped into their bones drip by drip until the body itself became a vessel for it. One night, a week after their arrival, Margaret woke to the sound of whispering. She assumed it was Anna talking in her sleep, but when she entered the girl's room, Anna sat upright, staring at the wall. "They are asking when we will leave," she said calmly, pointing at the corner where moonlight revealed nothing but cracked plaster. Margaret felt her chest tighten as she approached, unable to breathe. She carried Anna back to her own bed, but did not close her eyes again. In the morning, George found the marks. On the outer wall of the house, carved shallow into the wood, were shapes resembling elongated hands, 5 fingers but too thin, too sharp. He said nothing to his family, choosing instead to plane the wood smooth. Yet as he scraped away the evidence, he realized with sick certainty that the impressions had not been made with tools. The thought gnawed at George Hawkins, even as he tried to bury it beneath chores, routine, and stubborn silence. Each scrape of his plane across the wood had carried the unmistakable sensation that he was erasing not vandalism,
but a message. Margaret noticed the tension in his shoulders, though he never confessed what he had seen. She simply watched her husband work with a jaw set tight, and her suspicion grew sharper. By the second week in Millfield, the whispers of the children became more frequent. Anna claimed to hear her name called from the tree line each evening just before dusk, in a voice like her mother's but softer, stretched thinner as though passing through walls. James confessed that he sometimes saw his own shadow moving half a beat behind him, as if it had forgotten its place. Margaret did not know whether to scold them or pray harder. The doctor's notes later remark, "The children were not rehearsing stories for attention. Their accounts were detailed, consistent, and delivered with a kind of weary honesty no child should possess." Neighbors began to take notice. Mrs. Calloway, who lived nearest, visited under the guise of bringing preserves. She lingered in the parlor longer than courtesy required, her eyes flicking to the corners of the ceiling. When Margaret asked if something was amiss, the woman avoided the question and instead remarked that the house had stood empty for a long time. "Some places," she said quietly, "don't forget who lived in them." Margaret pressed for more, but the visitor left abruptly, basket empty, face pale. George began to rise earlier, wandering the perimeter of the property before dawn. He told himself he was looking for intruders, perhaps vagrants or mischievous youths, anything that could explain the marks and the noises. But he felt disturbed. The earth was whole, the dew unbroken. The stillness mocked his search. Each morning he returned to the house with his throat dry, unwilling to tell his wife that he now feared the absence of signs, more than their presence. Then came the night James screamed. He had gone to fetch water from the well behind the barn, a lantern swinging from his hand. Margaret heard the crash first, the lantern shattering against the stones, then his voice, ragged, torn from his chest. George reached him first. The boy clung to his father's coat, pointing into the darkness. "It stood there," James stammered. "It was taller than the barn, and it bent down as though it meant to take me." George found nothing but the overturned bucket and the smell of scorched oil from the broken lamp. Still, James trembled as if frost had entered his bones. The doctor's later reflection on this incident reads, "The boy's terror bore the unmistakable quality of truth. Children may exaggerate, but there is a certain rigidity in the body, a certain whiteness in the lips, when one has truly brushed against fear." He had not imagined, he had encountered. Margaret's faith began to erode. She insisted they invite the town pastor, Reverend Coulter, to bless the house. He came reluctantly, his prayers steady, but his gaze uncertain. At one point, as he sprinkled water near the stairs, he faltered, staring at the wall with something close to recognition. When George pressed him, the Reverend only muttered a line from Scripture, "The valley of shadows has no end for those who dwell within it." He left soon after, refusing supper. The children grew quieter. They no longer spoke of what they saw, but their silence was heavier than words. At night, Margaret sometimes woke to find all three huddled together in Anna's bed, whispering among themselves. When she asked why, they only replied that it felt safer where the corner shadows met, because the shadows were already full. George could not ignore it any longer. On the 10th night, as he lay awake, he felt a shift in the air, as though something had entered the room without opening a door. His chest tightened. The sheets felt damp, though the room was dry. And when he turned toward the window, a shape, darker than night itself, leaned across the glass. He bolted upright, his hand reaching for the lamp, but in that instant, he realized Margaret was awake too, staring at the same window, her lips parted in horror. And then came the whisper, low and deliberate, brushing across the room as if it had been spoken inside their own minds. The house felt altered, as though the timbers themselves held their breath. The next morning brought no comfort. Margaret avoided George's eyes, moving through the kitchen like a figure in a trance, while the children watched their parents with a wariness beyond their years. It was Anna who finally broke the silence at breakfast, her small voice barely more than a whisper. "If we are not the first, then where are the others?" Neither parent could answer. Later that day, George rode into town under the pretense of purchasing feed. In truth, he sought knowledge. At the general store, conversations shifted uneasily when he mentioned their farmhouse. Mr. Whitley, the storekeeper, offered a brittle smile and said the land had always been cheap for a reason. When George pressed further, Whitley lowered his voice. "That place remembers things," he muttered. "Families don't last long there, not because they leave, because they're taken." George demanded clarity, but Whitley would say no more. Back at the house, Margaret struggled to maintain normalcy. She kept the children inside, setting them to chores, but even within the walls, there was no safety. James reported that the shadows now seemed to gather in the hallways during the day, stretching longer than the light allowed. Emily, the middle child, claimed she heard laughter from the attic, though it was not the laughter of children. Margaret, desperate to protect them, considered leaving Millfield altogether. Yet George returned that evening with a grim resolve in his voice. "If others were taken, then we must understand how. Running will not save us if we don't know what hunts us." That night, George sat by the hearth, staring into the fire, as though searching for answers in the flames. Margaret finally asked the question she had avoided for days. "Do you believe this is a curse?" George did not reply immediately. His eyes narrowed, and his jaw clenched. Finally, he admitted, "I believe it is older than curses, something tied to the land itself." The children overheard. James approached his father, trembling, and confessed something he had hidden until then. The night he screamed by the well, he had not only seen the towering shadow, he had heard it speak. Its voice had been like 100 whispers woven into one, telling him, "We are patient." George pulled the boy close, his own chest heavy with dread. The doctor's later notes remark that such testimony from a child is often dismissed as night terror, but the consistency of detail, coupled with physical reaction, must be treated as genuine experience. As midnight approached, the Hawkins household braced against the darkness. Lamps were lit in every room, though the flames sputtered more than usual, as if starved of air. Margaret kept the children floorboards and the restless wind outside. But then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps on a staircase. Slow, measured, deliberate. George raised the rifle, but as the steps reached the landing, he saw no intruder, only a shadow lengthening along a wall, independent of any figure to cast it. The lantern flickered violently, throwing the silhouette into grotesque shapes. Margaret screamed from the bedroom, and in that moment, George realized with horror that the shadow on the wall was no longer solitary. There were many, countless forms pressed against the walls, crowding the hallways, their limbs stretched thin, their heads bowed low as though listening. And then, in a chorus that shook the house itself, they whispered, "You are part of us now." The words rolled through the corridors like a chant carried on air that had never been meant for human lungs. George staggered backward, rifle clutched tightly, his knuckles white. The lantern's light swung wildly across the hallway, yet the shadows clung, multiplying, as if the flame itself only nourished them. Margaret rushed from the bedroom, the children clinging to her skirts, and for a moment, the entire Hawkins family stood transfixed, surrounded by walls that pulsed with living darkness. The doctor's later report noted that this moment marked the transition from unease to undeniable proof of something unnatural. His observation was cold, clinical, but the Hawkins lived its terror. Margaret cried out, not in fear alone, but in a desperate command, "Leave us!" The sound of her voice seemed to scatter the shadows just for an instant, thinning them as though the force of her will burned brighter than the lantern. Yet the reprieve was short. The silhouettes twisted, regathered, and pressed closer still. George fired the rifle. The crack of the shot split the silence, and smoke clouded the hallway. But when the haze lifted, the bullet hole in the plaster was all that remained. The shadows were untouched, their whispering chorus swelling with something like laughter. James, standing closest to the wall, shouted that he felt them reaching for him, cold fingers brushing the back of his neck, though nothing visible touched his skin. Desperation drove George to act. He gathered his family into the parlor, slamming the door and barring it with a chair. The children huddled in the corner while Margaret clutched the Bible to her chest, muttering prayers through trembling lips. For a time, there was silence. No footsteps, no voices, only the frantic rhythm of their own hearts. But then, faintly, a new sound began. Scratching. George refused to let the children read, but the doctor, who later recorded the family's ordeal, wrote that the children already understood. Their silence was not ignorance, it was resignation. That day, George rode to Reverend Coulter once more. The pastor listened with a face like stone, his hands folded tightly as if wringing them might release the truth he dared not speak. At last, he admitted that families before had reported similar manifestations. Some disappeared without trace, others left in haste, abandoning everything. Millfield, he whispered, was founded on ground that never wanted us here. There are debts in this soil, and it collects them. He would say no more. George returned home with his jaw set, but inside he was breaking. He told Margaret only that they must endure, that faith and strength would carry them through. But at night, when he thought no one watched, Margaret saw him staring at the floorboards, lips moving without sound, as if he too now spoke with the unseen. The children grew stranger. Emily began drawing on scraps of paper, dark figures standing behind rows of stick children. When Margaret asked what they were, Emily answered matter-of-factly, "Our new family." Anna refused to sleep in her bed, insisting the shadows spoke to her more loudly when she lay alone. James took to pacing the hall at night, as though guarding something, though he would not say what. The doctor's notes reflect on this shift with chilling clarity. It was not that the children were losing themselves. It was that something else was claiming them, piece by piece, until their identities thinned into echoes. One evening, as George prepared to light the lamps, he found fresh marks on the outer wall of the house. This time, they were not the elongated hands of before. They were shapes of faces, pressed into the wood as though straining to push through. The features were crude yet unmistakable. Eyes, mouths, expressions of hunger. He ran his hand across them, but the impressions sank deeper, resisting erasure. And that night, the voices returned, louder than ever. No longer whispers, but declarations that shook the rafters. The Hawkins family is ours. The declaration reverberated through the farmhouse, rattling windows and quivering in the marrow of those who heard it. Margaret clutched the children tightly, her knuckles pale, while George stood frozen in the doorway, lantern raised, his lips pressed into a bloodless line. The walls seemed to breathe with the voices, and the shadows writhed like living smoke, pressing inward as though the house itself had turned against its inhabitants. The next day, Margaret urged that they flee Millfield at once. "We must go," she pleaded. "They follow, carrying their curse wherever they went." Margaret saw in his eyes a dangerous shift. He no longer fought only for survival, but for understanding. It was James who provided the next sign. The boy had begun to keep a crude diary, scribbled on torn pages with a charcoal stub. In it he recorded the words he claimed the shadows whispered to him. When Margaret discovered the journal, she nearly fainted. The writing was filled with phrases far too old for a child to know. Sentences that spoke of debts in blood and a covenant of silence sealed beneath Millfield's soil. George seized the pages, his hands trembling as he read. The doctor's later commentary on these writings observed, the boy's hand bore the erratic tremor of fear, yet the content revealed an intelligence not his own. It is not merely the repetition of overheard scripture or town gossip. It is communication of an alien order. In the following nights, George began to test the presence. He would step deliberately into darkened rooms, waiting. He whispered questions into the silence, sometimes receiving no answer, sometimes hearing faint murmurs that seemed to coil around his words like snakes. Margaret begged him to stop, but his obsession grew. "If we understand what binds them," he insisted, "we can break it." But Margaret's conviction was clear. You are not studying them, they are studying you. Meanwhile, the children's behavior deepened in strangeness. Emily began waking at dawn, standing by the window, and speaking to figures outside that no one else could see. Anna hummed lullabies she had never been taught, melodies so old and discordant they made Margaret's skin crawl. James grew quiet, withdrawn, his eyes often fixed on a single corner of the room. For long minutes at a time, as if listening. Neighbors started to avoid the Hawkins entirely. Whispers in town hinted that lights were seen burning at odd hours, and strange noises carried on the wind from their property. One farmer claimed to have seen figures moving across the Hawkins fields at night, though when he drew closer, there were no footprints. The isolation became total. One night, George descended into the cellar, lantern in hand, compelled by a pull he could not explain. On the dirt floor he found new markings, not scratched into the wood, but pressed into the earth itself. Circles overlapped, symbols crude yet deliberate, their geometry unfamiliar. He touched the grooves and felt warmth rising from beneath, as though the ground itself pulsed with a hidden vein. His heart pounded as he realized these marks had been refreshed, not relics of the past. Someone, or something, was still inscribing them. He returned upstairs pale, sweat dampening his collar, but said nothing to his family. Instead, he locked the cellar door and pocketed the key. Margaret sensed his silence and knew he concealed discoveries. Years later remarks, at this stage the family was no longer reacting to phenomena, they had entered into its system. They were participants in a pattern much older than themselves, drawn step by step into its logic. That night, George lay awake, clutching the hidden key. Around him, the house exhaled in slow, uneven breaths. The walls quivered faintly, and in the stillness between the creaks and sighs, the voices gathered again. They did not whisper this time.
They chanted, and within the rhythm of their chant, George heard his own name spoken with dreadful intimacy. The sound of it hollowed him, as though something had reached inside and brushed the edges of his soul. He did not tell Margaret what he had heard, but the strain etched itself into his face, his eyes shadowed, his voice brittle. The children noticed too. Emily asked him one morning if the Dark Ones had chosen him, and when George demanded what she meant, she simply shrugged and said, "They always pick one." Margaret grew more terrified of her husband than of the shadows themselves. She would find him standing at the window long after midnight, lips moving in silent conversations. At times, he seemed to forget where he was, answering questions the children never asked, his eyes fixed on empty corners. The doctor's notes record Margaret's desperate testimony. "He is slipping away. I fear I am losing him, not to madness, but to allegiance. It is as though the house itself is teaching him to belong." The key to the cellar never left George's pocket. Though he had locked the door, Margaret sometimes heard him descend in the small hours, lantern in hand. She begged him to stop, to let the earth keep its secrets. But he brushed her aside, muttering that what they faced was not a haunting, but a covenant. A system with rules that could be understood, perhaps even broken. Meanwhile, the children's connection to the shadows deepened. Anna drew shapes in the dust, circles and intersecting lines startlingly similar to those George had seen in the cellar. When asked where she had learned them, she replied that the shadows showed her, "Because they like me." Emily grew colder, speaking less and less, but when she did, her words cut with eerie clarity. "It's not about us," she told her mother one evening. "It's about Father. They've been waiting for him." George began to test the shadows with questions. In the dim hours before dawn, he would speak aloud, "What do you want?" At first, silence answered. Then, one night, he heard the reply, a chorus of voices layered like echoes inside stone, to finish what was begun. His skin crawled, but instead of retreating, he leaned closer to the darkness as though listening at a keyhole. The next day, he visited Reverend Coulter again, this time demanding answers. The pastor's composure broke. He confessed, consecrated in a different way. A burial site of rituals long forgotten by settlers. Families who built on it found themselves entangled in the remnants of old vows. "The land remembers blood," Coulter whispered, eyes darting, "and it collects its debts through those willing to listen." George returned home more unsettled than before, though in his heart, Margaret sensed, he was not deterred. He was tempted. The doctor's later commentary is striking here. At this stage, the line between resistance and invitation had blurred. The subject no longer viewed the phenomenon as external, but as an inheritance. Such transitions mark the most dangerous threshold. That night, Margaret confronted George. "You are letting them in," she cried, her voice breaking. But George only stared at her, his expression unreadable. "Perhaps they were never outside to begin with," he murmured. The children huddled together in silence. Even Anna, once so fearless, now looked at her father with wide, uncertain eyes. Margaret resolved that if George would not protect them, she must. She began to make plans, to seek help, to flee if she had to. Yet the house seemed to hear her thoughts. Doors groaned, shutters slammed, and the shadows grew bolder, pressing against the walls in daylight. And then, on a night when George had again slipped into the cellar, Margaret awoke to find James standing at her bedside. His face was pale, his voice shaking. "Mother," he whispered.
They said, "Tonight is the night they'll show us what Father has agreed to." The words fell into Margaret's heart like stones. She sat upright, clutching James by the shoulders, searching his face for some hint that this was merely a dream-born fancy. But his eyes were wide, glassy with terror, and his body trembled as though he carried the weight of someone else's secret. Margaret realized in that instant that her husband's descent into darkness was no longer his alone. The children had been drawn into the bargain. She rose swiftly, shaking Margaret's fatigue from her body. She dressed the children in haste, whispering that they must be ready to leave. Emily asked no questions, though her expression bore a grim knowledge, as if she already understood. Anna clung to her doll, silent but watchful. Margaret gathered them close, her own heart hammering with the urgency of flight. But as she reached for the door, it refused to yield. The latch moved, but the wood remained rigid, as though held by hands unseen. The doctor's later notes remarked on Margaret's testimony with a chilling. The globe brightened, swelling into a strange pulsation, as though the earth itself beat with light. And with it came the voices, low, layered, impossible to ignore. The children covered their ears, but even muffled, the words pressed inside their skulls. Witness, join, continue. Summoning all her courage, Margaret forced the parlor window open, shoving the children through one by one. Emily stumbled into the grass. James pulled Anna behind him, and Margaret climbed after, skirts tearing on the frame. For a moment, hope surged through her veins, but as her feet touched the ground, the woods ahead shifted. Shadows stood there, not scattered, but assembled, like a congregation waiting. Their forms were elongated, distorted, yet their stillness carried a terrible authority. James gasped. "They won't let us go." Margaret seized his hand, urging the children forward. They ran toward the barn, hearts pounding, but the air grew thick, every breath heavier than the last. The barn door loomed, and she shoved it open, dragging the children inside. The space smelled of hay and iron, ordinary and grounding. For a fleeting second, Margaret believed they had escaped. Then Anna pointed upward. Along the rafters, the shadows clung like bats, their limbs hanging down, swaying without wind. One by one, their heads turned. Margaret collapsed to her knees, clutching the children as the barn darkened unnaturally, as though every crack and hole in the wood had been sealed. The doctor's journal describes what happened next with clinical detachment. Subject reported mass visual manifestation. Entities appeared to mimic human posture, but with exaggerated proportions. Vocalizations were unified and comprehensible. The voices filled the barn, rising in a dreadful litany. "George has agreed. George has seen. George has given." The children wailed. Margaret shouted above the din, "What has he given?" For an instant, the shadows paused, as if acknowledging her question. Then they answered in unison. "Blood bound to blood." The meaning struck Margaret like a blow. She staggered back, clutching Anna, her mind racing. If George had indeed agreed to something in the cellar, it was not merely his soul they sought. It was the children, the continuation of whatever covenant bound this land. Suddenly the barn door burst open. George stood framed in the doorway, lantern in one hand, the cellar key glinting in the other.
His face was pale, but strangely calm, as if illuminated by more than firelight. His voice, though quiet, belonged to him. Margaret's grip on Anna tightened, her breath shallow, as she whispered the truth she could no longer avoid. He's given them the children. The barn trembled with the weight of the unseen congregation. The rafters creaked, hay shifted, and the chorus rose again, voices that did not speak but invaded. It is sealed, it is bound, it is ours. Emily clutched her mother's arms, sobbing. James glared at his father with a rage no child should know. "What did you do?" he shouted, his voice cracking. But George did not answer. Instead, he stepped inside, setting the lantern on the dirt floor. Its glow did not push the darkness back, but seemed to nourish it, as though the shadows fed on light itself. Margaret backed away. Children pressed behind her, but the barn was no refuge. The air itself thickened, pressing down until every breath burned. The doctor's later examination of the family's testimonies describes this moment as a psychological fracture point. The matriarch understood betrayal not as an external force, but as domestic treason, amplifying terror through intimacy. Margaret herself would later describe the feeling as a second death, worse than the first, because it came not from strangers, but from the man who once swore to protect us. George raised the cellar key. The shadows hushed at once, as if reverent. "This is the only way," he said, his tone quiet but resolute. "If they are not given something, they will take everything. I've bargained. I've kept them at bay. One sacrifice to spare the rest." Margaret staggered back, her knees weak. The word sacrifice clung to the air like smoke. "No," she whispered, shaking her head violently. "Not our children, never." But George's hand trembled with conviction, rather than hesitation. His voice sharpened. "You don't understand, Margaret. They don't want us all. They want a line, a continuation. If one child is bound, the rest will live, and so will we." The children screamed, Anna's cries piercing the dark. James leapt forward, trying to tear the key from his father's hand, but George shoved him back with surprising force. The boy fell, striking the ground, his breath knocked from him. Margaret rushed to his side, fury blazing through her terror. "You're not saving us," she spat. "You're damning us." The shadows writhed, as though savoring the conflict. Their whispers filled the barn, urging, promising, binding. Choose, choose, choose. In that moment, Margaret made a choice of her own. Snatching up a rusted sickle from the wall, she brandished it with trembling hands, placing herself between George and the children. "If you touch them," she warned, "you will not live to see another dawn." George looked at her, something like sorrow flickering through his expression, but it was swallowed quickly by resolve. "Then you will doom us all." The barn shook violently, beams groaning as dust rained from the rafters. The lantern toppled, spilling flame across the hay, and light flared wildly against the shifting dark. Margaret screamed for the children to run, but before they could move, the shadows surged. A tidal wave of black pressing down from the rafters and rising from the floor, converging on the family with suffocating force. And above it all, Margaret heard George's voice, carried on the roar of the darkness. "One must be taken." The words tore through the barn like a verdict, binding every soul within it. Margaret's scream echoed against the beams, her hands tightening on the sickle until her knuckles bled white. The children clung to her skirts, their cries drowned by the rising roar of the shadows. For a moment it felt as if the entire world had shrunk to this single command, this single demand for blood. The barn fire sputtered, its flames collapsing inward as though starved by the darkness. Instead of burning bright, the fire curled into black smoke, feeding the shapes that writhed along the walls. Margaret pulled the children toward the door, but the wood refused to budge, sealed as if welded shut. The shadows pressed closer, their whispers swelling into a chant that pounded against her ribs. Choose, choose, choose. George stood still, lantern smashed at his feet, his face bathed in the sickly glow of the pulsing dark. He raised the key again, his voice low, steady, almost reverent. If I give one, the rest will survive. It is the only way. James, his small fists clenched, staggered forward despite his mother's restraining hand. Then take me, he shouted, voice cracking. Margaret gasped, dragging him back, tears streaming down her face. No, she cried. No, you don't understand what you're saying. But James's eyes, wide and burning, held something that chilled her more than the shadows. He believed this was the only path. The doctor's account, pieced together later from Margaret's fractured testimony, coldly observes, in moments of extreme terror, children may adopt the role of sacrifice, perceiving it as the only means to restore order. It is not nobility but the reflex of despair. Margaret screamed again, lifting the sickle high. No one will be taken, she declared. Her voice cracked, but the force of her will cut through the chant for an instant. The shadows recoiled, twisting back into the rafters as though stunned. Silence filled the barn, suffocating and fragile. George's expression hardened. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Margaret, he said, his voice calm but edged with finality. You George's chest, and for the first time his composure cracked. He stumbled back, eyes wide, not from fear of the blade, but from the defiance in her. You would stand against me? He asked, voice breaking. I will stand against anything that comes for our children, she spat. The shadows stirred again, restless, feeding on the conflict. The chant resumed, lower now, heavier, pressing into their skulls like stone. Blood bound to blood. Emily suddenly collapsed, her small body seizing as if caught by invisible hands. Margaret dropped beside her, sobbing, while George stood paralyzed. The girl's lips moved, whispering words that did not belong to her. The ground remembers. The ground waits. The ground takes. The doctor's reflection is chilling in its precision. The entity used the child as a mouthpiece. The message was not warning, but inevitability. Margaret lifted Emily, clutching her against her chest, desperate. She turned to George, her voice ragged. If you ever loved us, stop this. Fight it. But George only lowered his head, his shoulders trembling as the shadows converged again, wrapping the walls, filling every inch of air. His voice was a whisper, broken, yet resolute. It is too late. They have chosen. And in that moment, the barn doors slammed open of their own accord. The night outside darker than any night should be, as though the world beyond had emptied itself to welcome what was coming. The gaping maw of the night yawned wider than the barn itself, swallowing the threshold with a blackness deeper than ordinary absence of light. Margaret staggered backward, clutching Emily against her chest, while Anna buried her face in her mother's dress. James stood rigid, staring into that impossible darkness with eyes too wide for his young face. The shadows seemed to bow toward the opening, their elongated forms, bending as if in reverence. A cold wind poured in, though the trees outside stood utterly still. George dropped to his knees, lantern shards crunching beneath him, the cellar key still dangling from his trembling hand. It is here, he whispered, almost in awe. The covenant itself. Margaret felt bile rise in her throat. You've brought it to us, she spat, her voice breaking. And now it comes for what you promised. From the void beyond the barn door, something stirred. Not a figure, not flesh, but a density in the dark, like the weight of a mountain leaning forward. The air grew so heavy, Margaret could hardly draw breath. The children whimpered. Even the shadows pressed themselves flatter to the barn walls, as though acknowledging a higher authority. The doctor's reconstructed notes describe this event clinically. The manifestation suggests a hierarchical structure, lesser entities deferring to a primary force. Subject radiant with a terrible conviction. It asks for one, only one. That is mercy. He extended a hand toward Anna. Margaret screamed, stepping back with the child, brandishing the sickle again. "Over my body," she growled. The presence loomed closer, its weight pressing into every nail and beam of the barn. The structure groaned, hay rustling though no breeze touched it. A voice rose, not with sound but inside their skulls, vibrating bone and marrow. Blood for silence, blood for peace, blood for Millfield. James suddenly broke free of his mother's grasp and stepped forward. His fists clenched, his chin lifted with reckless defiance. "Take me, then," he shouted. His voice cracked, but did not falter. "Leave my sisters alone!" Margaret lunged, pulling him back, but the shadows surged, encircling him. George cried out, torn between admiration and despair. "Brave boy," he whispered, tears glinting in the lantern's dying glow. But the entity did not take him. Instead it paused, its darkness folding in on itself as though amused. The voice returned, softer now, yet no less merciless. "Not offered, chosen." The barn quaked, beams splitting as dust poured down. Margaret shielded the children, coughing, while George pressed his forehead to the dirt, whispering incoherent prayers. The doctor's notes remark on this detail. The patriarch's submission was total. At this juncture, his autonomy may be considered extinguished. Then came the moment that seared itself into Margaret's memory forever. The shadows pulled back from James and instead reached for Emily, the quiet one, the child who had spoken in borrowed voices. She stiffened in her mother's arms, eyes rolling back, mouth opening on a scream that was not her own. "It was always me," she gasped. "They marked me before we came." Margaret clutched her tighter, weeping. But Emily's body convulsed, her small frame arching unnaturally as if invisible strings yanked her upward. George sobbed into the dirt, unable to look. Anna wailed, covering her ears. The barn door gaped wider, the void demanding, pulling. Margaret fought, pulling Emily down, her muscles straining with impossible strength born of desperation. But the presence spoke again, louder now, unignorable. "The child carries our covenant. To resist is to invite all to fall." Margaret's arms burned as Emily rose higher, slipping from her grasp inch by inch. Her screams filled the barn, a mother's rage clashing with a darkness older than names. And in the midst of that chaos, Emily opened her eyes. Shadows thickened, forming a column around the girl, lifting her higher into the choking air of the barn. Margaret screamed until her voice cracked, but the sound seemed to vanish into the void. James clawed at the shadows with his bare hands, but his fingers passed through cold smoke that burned without flame. Anna collapsed to her knees, sobbing, clutching her doll like a talisman. George did not rise. He only whispered over and over, "It is done. It is done." His surrender was more unbearable.
than the darkness itself. The barn doors slammed shut behind them, cutting away the world outside. The void pulsed, drawing Emily's small body upward, as though she were a tethered offering. And then came the voice, the one that had carried through generations, echoing off the marrow of the land itself. One to remember, one to continue. Margaret's resolve hardened like iron beneath fire. With a cry torn from her soul, she swung the sickle in a desperate arc. The blade met resistance, not wood, not flesh, but something that howled as it split. The shadows shrieked, the column around Emily flickering, shuddering. For a moment, the grip loosened, and Emily fell back into her mother's arms, gasping, her eyes wide and human again. The doctor's analysis of this event is brief but chilling. Violent resistance altered the manifestation. The phenomenon was not invulnerable. It responded to defiance, but it adapted. Indeed, the shadows regrouped swiftly. Their chorus shifted, rising in a fury not of words but of intent, filling every fiber of the barn with a pressure that threatened to shatter bone. Margaret stumbled to her feet, clutching Emily against her chest, sickle in her free hand. She turned to George, desperate, pleading, "Help me. For God's sake, help me." But George lifted his face at last, and in his eyes she saw only the abyss. His voice, hoarse yet resolute, carried the weight of his betrayal. "I gave them what they asked for. You cannot undo it." Something broke inside Margaret then. She realized that her husband was not simply lost. He had become their instrument. The shadows no longer needed to persuade him. He was theirs, body and phenomenon. It is not victory, but it is interruption. And in that interruption, Margaret realized her chance. With a guttural cry, she shoved the children toward the fractured barn door. James grasped Anna's hand, dragging her into the night beyond. Margaret followed with Emily in her arms, lungs burning, sickle raised against the pursuing dark. But as she crossed the threshold, she looked back. George remained on his knees, his face lifted to the shadows, lips parted in rapture, and as the barn caved inward, collapsing into the earth itself, his voice rose above the cacophony. "You cannot escape, Margaret. They will come for you. They will come for them all." George's final cry rang through the night as the barn collapsed behind them, its timbers twisting into the earth as though swallowed whole. Margaret stumbled forward into the fields, clutching Emily tight, James dragging Anna at her side. The night air should have been a relief, but it carried no peace, only the oppressive certainty that George's words were not a threat, but a promise. The Hawkins children wept, their small voices muffled against the vast emptiness of the land. The farmhouse loomed ahead, but Margaret knew it was no refuge. That place belonged to the shadows as much as the barn did. Still, she guided them there, knowing only that standing in the open left them exposed to eyes that watched from every corner of the night. When they reached the porch, the front door swung open before she touched it. The children froze, clinging to her skirts, their breaths shallow. Margaret raised the sickle, her arm shaking, and stepped inside. The air was colder than it should have been, the room still, as if time itself had slowed, yet the silence pressed into her ears until it became unbearable. The doctor's later account captures this moment with chilling precision. The subject entered what she described as a void disguised as home. Familiar surroundings stripped of warmth, reconstituted into a stage for further psychological dismantling. Upstairs, the floorboards groaned. Margaret's heart seized. She had left George behind in the ruin of the barn, yet she knew with certainty that the steps belonged to him. Emily whimpered, hiding her face in her mother's dress. James whispered, "He's here." Margaret forced herself up the staircase, each step protesting beneath her weight. The children followed reluctantly, their small hands gripping her skirts. At the top, the hallway stretched unnaturally long, doors on either side yawning wider than before, their shadows spilling out like ink. The last door, their bedroom, stood open. Inside, George sat calmly on the bed, lantern light pooling around him. His face was pale, his clothes streaked with soot, yet he appeared untouched by the barn's collapse. He lifted his eyes slowly, fixing them on
"But I can make it easier if you stop fighting." Margaret's grip on the sickle tightened until her hand ached. "You are not my husband anymore," she said, her voice quivering but fierce. The children whimpered behind her. George extended his hand toward them. They love the children. They whisper to them because they see themselves in them. Why resist what is already chosen? The shadows thickened along the walls, curling into figures, tall, elongated, their faces featureless yet intent. They leaned closer, their whispers soft, almost coaxing. Anna began to step forward, as though drawn by invisible threads, until James yanked her back. Margaret raised the sickle high, her chest heaving. "You'll have to kill me before you take them." George rose, his movements calm, deliberate. "Not kill," he said softly. "Deliver." The figures pressed closer, the air tightening around them. Margaret braced herself, but just as she prepared to strike, Emily pulled away from her arms. The child's eyes were once again black, endless. She stepped toward George, her small voice carrying with dreadful clarity. "It isn't him you should fear, Mama. It's me." The doctor's reflection on this testimony notes, "At this stage, possession is not the seizure of the body, but the reconstitution of identity. The child no longer speaks as victim, but as emissary." Margaret's scream tore through the house, but Emily did not flinch. Instead, she smiled faintly, a gesture that did not belong to her. And as the shadows surged forward, filling the room with suffocating dark, Emily whispered with a voice not her own, "Tonight, the covenant is sealed." Emily's voice, no longer hers, but something vast, ancient and cold, shattered what little remained of Margaret's resolve. The shadows crowded in, pressing against the walls, bending the air itself. George stood behind his daughter as though guarding a relic, his eyes glazed with reverence. James pulled Anna behind him, trembling, his small body braced against forces far greater than he could comprehend. Margaret raised the sickle again, her breath ragged. "No covenant will take my child," she cried, but her words faltered in the suffocating dark. The shadows pulsed, their collective whispers weaving through her defiance like barbed wire. "The covenant was made long before you. You only live inside it." The doctor's notes on this moment read with clinical detachment. The subject's struggle reveals the futility of resistance once the identity of the child is subsumed. The phenomenon demands continuity, not destruction. It is less an ending than a transfer. Emily stepped forward,
her eyes reflecting not light but void.
Chosen, she belongs where we cannot follow.
No, Margaret screamed, lunging forward. The sickle cut through the air, through shadow, through silence. For an instant the darkness shrieked as if wounded. Emily stumbled, her body shuddering, her gaze flickering between black abyss and terrified child. "Mama," she whimpered, her real voice breaking through. Margaret seized her, clutching her daughter to her chest, desperate, trembling. But the reprieve lasted only seconds. The house groaned, the floorboards buckled, and the shadows surged back in fury. They pressed close, enveloping George, who lifted his arms as if welcoming them. His body jerked, twisted, then collapsed to his knees. His lips moved in prayer or praise, it was impossible to tell which. The children screamed. James pounded the floor with his fists, shouting, "Leave us alone." His voice cracked, but the force of his will burned through the dark. For a moment, the shadows faltered. The doctor later noted, even in the most oppressive manifestations, human resistance, particularly from the uncorrupted, appears to fracture the phenomenon's cohesion. Margaret seized that fracture. She dragged all three children toward the stairs, shouting, "Run!" The house shook violently, windows rattling as glass cracked and splintered. Shadows clawed along the walls, stretching toward them, but Margaret swung the sickle again and again, her screams filling the house. They reached the ground floor, the front door yawning open as if mocking escape. Beyond it lay only the night, dense, oppressive, unnatural. Still, Margaret shoved the children through, forcing their small bodies into the cold air. She stumbled after them, Emily still clutched in her arms. Behind her, George's voice thundered, warped by something more than human lungs. "You cannot leave. Millfield remembers its own." Margaret turned, tears streaking her dirt-stained face. For a heartbeat she saw her husband as he once was, his features softened by something like sorrow. But then his eyes rolled back, black veins spreading across his skin, and he rose as though pulled by strings. The shadows surged outward, spilling from the house into the night, their chorus rising. One bound, all bound. One taken, all claimed. Margaret ran, the children stumbling at her side, across the fields that seemed to stretch endlessly. The night pursued them, swallowing the earth beneath their feet. The house behind collapsing into itself like a wound, devouring flesh. But even as she ran, Margaret heard Emily whisper against her chest, her voice caught between child and something infinite. "It isn't over, Mama. I am still theirs." The words pressed against Margaret's ear like frost, sinking deeper than sound, as if her daughter's confession had been etched directly into her bones. She staggered through the dark fields, clutching Emily to her chest, the other children stumbling at her side. Farmhouse behind them collapsed with a thunderous groan, swallowed by the earth as though it had never stood. Yet the shadows did not vanish. They stretched with them, threading across the ground, relentless. Margaret whispered prayers beneath her breath, though she no longer knew whether they reached heaven or only echoed back from the soil that had already claimed too much. James stumbled, nearly falling, and Margaret yanked him upright, her voice breaking. "Keep running. Don't look back." But when she dared to glance down, she saw their shadows lagging behind them, not in step, but twisted, elongated, moving at half the pace, as though they belonged to another world entirely. The doctor's report on their escape remains one of his most haunting observations. Disassociation of shadow from subject suggests a severing of identity. The children were not simply haunted, they were being rewritten. They reached the edge of the woods, the trees looming black against a blacker sky. Margaret paused, gasping for breath, but Anna pointed with a trembling hand. Between the trunks, faint figures swayed silent, waiting. The forest itself had become an assembly.
Margaret turned sharply, dragging the children away from its border, but the ground ahead rippled as though it too resisted their flight. Emily stirred in her arms. When Margaret looked down, her daughter's eyes were open again, deep, endless, swallowing light. "You can't run from them," Emily said softly, her voice both hers and not hers. "I am their promise. They will always find us." "No," Margaret whispered, holding her tighter. "You are my child, not theirs." Emily smiled faintly, a gesture that did not belong on a child's face. "You'll see." The children's exhaustion weighed heavy, their small legs faltering. Margaret pulled them into a hollow by the hedgerow, gathering them close, pressing their faces into her arms, as though she could shield them from the entire world. For a brief moment, silence returned, broken only by their ragged breaths. She dared to hope they might survive until dawn. But the stillness fractured. A faint scratching began, on the ground, on the trees, in the air itself. The sound built until it became a rhythm, deliberate, like writing. And then, on the soil before them, lines began to etch themselves into existence, glowing faintly with a pale light. Circles overlapped, intersecting, symbols repeating. The same markings George had found in the cellar now carved themselves into the living earth. James gasped. "It's following us." Margaret gathered them tighter, whispering, "Don't look, don't answer." "I told you, Mama. It isn't over. I am theirs." The doctor's note here is grim. Subject's testimony suggests permanent possession of the child's will, interwoven with identity. No separation can be achieved without destruction. The ground beneath them shuddered, the symbols glowing brighter, casting sickly light on their pale faces. The shadows pressed closer, encircling them, taller than trees, whispering in unison. And then Margaret understood. They would never stop, not until something or someone was given fully. Clutching the sickle once more, her grip white with desperation, Margaret lifted her gaze to the void above, her voice breaking into the night. "If it must end, then take me instead." The shadows paused, the whispers ceased. For the first time since Millfield had swallowed her family, silence fell. And from Emily's lips came a single answer, soft as breath. "It doesn't work that way." Emily's voice, soft yet final, pierced Margaret deeper than any blade. The shadows pressed closer, their forms swelling as though her daughter's words had given them permission to claim what was already theirs. Margaret's plea to be taken in place of her child dissolved into the night, unheard or deliberately refused. The ground beneath them pulsed with that faint, pale light, circles and sigils glowing brighter, weaving their family into a pattern older than their name, older than the town itself. James clutched his mother's arm, his voice shaking. "We can still fight, Mama. We can run again." But Margaret knew the truth. Running only redrew the same circle. Every road bent back toward Millfield. Every prayer echoed inside its soil. Emily stepped out of her mother's arms, her face serene in the unnatural glow. The shadows bowed toward her, their whispers unified. "She is ours. She is the bridge." Margaret tried to grab her, but James and Anna held her back, sobbing, terrified. It was as if the children themselves feared what Emily had become. The doctor's posthumous analysis is stark. By the end, the mother no longer resisted the phenomenon directly, but fought the psychological erosion of hope. The child had become not merely a victim, but a vessel of continuation. Margaret screamed Emily's name, but her daughter only turned, her blackened eyes reflecting nothing human. "Don't cry, Mama," she whispered. "If I go, the rest of you live." The words shattered Margaret's resolve. She lunged forward, sickle in hand, heart torn between salvation and destruction. Could severing the child free her soul, or damn them all forever? Her breath hitched, her arm trembled.
But in that moment, the shadows surged, wrapping Emily completely. The glow erupted, blinding, and Margaret's world collapsed into a single scream that was both hers and not hers. When the light faded, Emily was gone. The fields lay silent, the air empty, the symbols scorched into the ground as black ash. Margaret held James and Anna, their tears soaking into her dress. Her sickle fell into the dirt, useless now, its edge dulled by futility. George was gone. Emily was gone. And only the two children remained, terrified, trembling, clinging to a mother hollowed by grief. The farmhouse never stood again. Neighbors who ventured near the land reported hearing faint whispers in the fields, children's laughter mixed with voices too ancient to name. Some claimed to see a small figure standing at the edge of the woods, her eyes shining black in the moonlight. None dared approach. The doctor, years later, closed his file with words that haunt even today. The Hawkins case cannot be explained by medicine nor dismissed as hysteria. It is a record of inheritance, something passed through soil, through shadow, through blood. Whether Emily Hawkins lived or not is irrelevant. She continues. And so, the story of the Hawkins family remains a wound in Millfield's history. Margaret vanished soon after, leaving no trace beyond the rumors of a woman seen wandering roads at night calling a child's name. James and Anna were later found in the care of distant relatives, but they never spoke of what happened. The land itself lay abandoned, but the town never truly forgot. Some say the covenant is not finished, that Millfield's soil still waits, patient as stone, listening for the next family, willing or unwilling to bleed into its memory. Perhaps the shadows are not confined to Millfield at all. Perhaps they follow those who have touched them, spreading thin and unseen, waiting for a moment of weakness. And if that is true, then the Hawkins were not the first, nor will they be the last. Because if Emily was right, and she belonged to them, then so too might every child who whispers to the dark when no one else is listening. The story of the Hawkins family is a tale of betrayal, survival, and inevitability. It forces us to ask, are curses chosen, or are they inherited? Do we create our own demons, or do we only awaken the ones buried beneath our feet? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories, because sometimes the past does not stay buried. It waits. And when it rises, it does not come alone.